Right now, something about XRP is making people uncomfortable in the crypto space, and it is not just another price movement or random market noise. There is a deeper conversation happening around wealth distribution, early holders, and how a small group of wallets may already be sitting on massive control over supply. When people hear XRP rich list, they usually think it is just numbers on a screen, but the reality behind it is much more serious and connected to long term holding behavior, market psychology, and supply concentration. And if you are holding XRP or thinking about entering, you need to understand what this actually means before making any emotional decision. When people talk about the XRP rich list, they are referring to wallets that hold the largest amounts of XRP across the ledger. These are not hidden secrets or conspiracy ideas. They are visible wallet balances that can be tracked through blockchain explorers. But the mistake most beginners make is assuming this list tells the full story of wealth or control. It does not. It only shows distribution, not intent, not identity, and not future movement. What makes XRP different from many other digital assets is the way its supply was structured from the beginning. A large portion of the total supply was created early, and instead of being mined over time like Bitcoin, it was pre issued. This means the distribution pattern was never going to look evenly spread across millions of small holders in the early stages. Instead, it naturally created large wallets, including institutional wallets, exchanges, and early participants who accumulated during low valuation periods. Now, here's where things get interesting. When people see large wallets holding hundreds of millions or even billions of XRP, the immediate assumption is that these are individual whales controlling the market, but that assumption is too simple. Many of these wallets belong to exchanges where user funds are stored collectively, and others belong to liquidity providers or long term escrow mechanisms. So the rich list is not a clean picture of personal wealth. It is a mixed structure of custody, distribution, and infrastructure. Another important detail that most people ignore is movement behavior. A wallet holding a large amount of XRP does not automatically mean it is actively trading or influencing price. In fact, many top wallets remain inactive for long periods. That inactivity often creates fear in retail investors because they assume something is being held back or prepared. But in reality, most large holders are not reacting to short term price changes at all. They operate on completely different timelines. This brings us to the psychological side of the XRP rich list. When new investors see concentration of supply, they often feel late to the market. They believe the opportunity has already been taken by others, which creates hesitation or panic buying. But concentration alone does not determine future value. Markets are not driven by who already holds supply, but by how and when that supply moves into circulation. At the same time, it is also true that large holders can influence liquidity conditions. If significant wallets decide to move funds into exchanges, it can temporarily affect price behavior. But again, this is not unique to XRP, it exists in every major crypto asset. The difference is that XRP's distribution structure makes these movements more visible and more frequently discussed. So the real takeaway here is not fear or excitement, it is awareness. The XRP rich list is not a signal of guaranteed future outcomes, nor is it a hidden blueprint of price direction. It is simply a snapshot of distribution at a given time, shaped by history, exchanges, and long term holders. We will go deeper into how these large wallets actually interact with the market and why most retail interpretations of whales are usually incorrect. The moment people see large XRP wallets on a rich list, they immediately assume there is a small group of individuals sitting on massive power over the market. That assumption sounds logical at first, but once you understand how blockchain custody actually works, it starts breaking apart. Most of the biggest XRP wallets are not personal accounts. They are infrastructure wallets, exchange wallets, liquidity pools, or custody systems that represent thousands or even millions of users combined. This is where a major misunderstanding begins. A single wallet showing hundreds of millions of XRP does not mean one person owns it. In most cases, that wallet is controlled by a centralized exchange, and the XRP inside belongs to users who have deposited their funds there. So, what looks like one whale is actually a collective pool of retail and institutional holdings stored under one address for operational efficiency. This alone changes the entire interpretation of the rich list. Now, there are also escrow wallets and institutional reserves involved in the XRP ecosystem. These are structured holdings designed to release XRP in controlled amounts over time rather than flooding the market all at once. This mechanism was created to manage supply predictability and reduce sudden shocks. When people see these wallets on a rich list, they often panic and assume accumulation or manipulation. But in reality, these wallets follow predefined release schedules, not emotional trading decisions. Another important factor is liquidity distribution. Exchanges must hold large XRP balances to ensure smooth trading for users. If you buy XRP on a major exchange, your coins are not immediately sitting in a personal wallet on the blockchain. They are accounted for internally until you withdraw them. That means exchange wallets naturally appear at the top of rich lists, but they are not investors in the traditional sense. Now, let's talk about the psychological trap this creates. Retail investors often look at these rankings and assume that top wallets have inside knowledge or control over future price direction. That leads to two extreme behaviors: either blind fear, thinking the market is rigged, or blind copying, thinking they should follow whales without understanding context. Both approaches are flawed because they ignore the structure behind the data. Here is a more realistic way to think about it. Large wallets in XRP are not a signal of secret control. They are a reflection of how custody systems, exchanges, and early distribution models were built. The blockchain does not distinguish between a billionaire investor and a trading platform, it only shows balances. Interpretation is where most people go wrong. There is also another layer that many overlook. Even if some large holders are early investors or institutions, that does not automatically mean they are actively influencing price. Holding a large amount does not equal market manipulation. In fact, many large holders are long term oriented and avoid frequent trading because moving large volumes can create unfavorable price slippage for themselves. What actually matters more than wallet size is movement behavior. When large XRP wallets stay inactive, it suggests accumulation or long term holding. When they start transferring to exchanges, it may indicate distribution or liquidity preparation. But even then, context matters more than fear driven interpretation. One transfer does not define a trend. So the key takeaway from this part is simple but important. The XRP rich list is not a leaderboard of individuals controlling the market. It is a structural map of custody systems, exchanges, and aggregated holdings. Misreading it leads to emotional decisions, and emotional decisions are where most retail losses happen. We will break down how these wallets actually behave over time and what real on chain movement patterns can tell us about market sentiment without falling into speculation traps. To really understand XRP's rich list, you cannot just look at static wallet balances. That is the biggest mistake most people make. A snapshot of who holds what tells you almost nothing about what is actually happening in the market. The real insight comes from movement patterns over time because blockchain data becomes meaningful only when you track behavior, not just numbers. When large XRP wallets move funds, the first reaction from retail traders is usually panic or excitement, but both reactions are often wrong because they ignore context. A transfer from a large wallet to an exchange does not automatically mean selling is happening. It could be internal rebalancing, liquidity provisioning, or custody restructuring. Without understanding the purpose behind the movement, interpreting it as bullish or bearish is just guessing. Now, let's break this down in a practical way. There are generally three types of behavior seen in large XRP wallets. First is accumulation behavior, where wallets receive XRP over time and rarely send it out. This usually suggests long term holding or cold storage. Second is redistribution behavior, where funds gradually move to exchanges or other wallets, which can indicate preparation for liquidity use or gradual selling. Third is operational movement, which is common in exchange wallets and has nothing to do with market sentiment at all. The problem is that most retail investors treat all three behaviors the same. They see a transfer and assume it is a signal. But in reality, without knowing the identity behind the wallet, a single transaction means very little. This is why professional analysts focus on clusters of movement rather than individual transactions. One transfer can be noise, but repeated patterns over days or weeks can indicate intent. Another important detail is timing. Large XRP movements often happen during low volatility periods, not during hype spikes. This is intentional in many cases because moving large amounts during high volatility can lead to poor execution prices or unnecessary market attention. So, when people suddenly notice a large wallet movement, it is often already part of a planned structure, not a surprise event. There is also a psychological trap in interpreting whale behavior. People assume that large holders always act before retail and that following their movements guarantees profit. That assumption is flawed because it ignores one key fact. Large wallets do not operate on the same goals as retail traders. Retail investors look for short term gains, while large holders often think in terms of liquidity management, infrastructure needs, or long term positioning. These goals are not aligned, so copying behavior directly rarely works. Now, another layer that adds confusion is exchange activity. When XRP is moved into exchange wallets, it increases visible supply on trading platforms, which often triggers fear narratives about selling pressure. But this is not always accurate. Exchanges constantly shuffle funds between cold storage and hot wallets for security and liquidity balance. So, what looks like inflow or outflow pressure is often just internal accounting. A more reliable way to interpret XRP movements is to look at net flow over time rather than single events. If inflows to exchanges consistently outweigh outflows over a sustained period, it may indicate distribution. If the opposite happens, it may suggest accumulation. But even then, macro market conditions, news cycles, and liquidity demand all influence interpretation. So the key point in this part is simple. XRP wallet movements are not standalone signals. They are part of a larger system of liquidity management, exchange operations, and long term holding strategies. Misreading them leads to emotional trading decisions, and emotional trading is exactly what the market tends to punish. We will go deeper into how supply concentration affects market psychology and why seeing rich lists often creates fear or hype that has nothing to do with actual price direction. One of the biggest psychological triggers in crypto is supply concentration. When people see that a large portion of XRP is held in a relatively small number of wallets, they immediately jump to conclusions. Some think it means manipulation is guaranteed, while others think it signals hidden strength and future explosive growth. Both reactions are emotional, not analytical, and both miss the real structure of how supply actually works in digital assets. To understand this properly, you need to separate perception from mechanics. The XRP ledger does not hide wallet balances, so what people see on rich lists feels like transparency. But transparency without context often creates more confusion than clarity. A list of large wallets tells you nothing about intent, nothing about time horizon, and nothing about whether those holdings are active or dormant. Now, here is the key issue: humans are wired to interpret inequality as control. When a few wallets hold a large percentage of supply, the brain naturally assumes power is centralized. But in blockchain systems, distribution is not the same as control. Holding XRP does not give automatic influence over network rules, validation, or protocol changes. So even if concentration exists, it does not directly translate into market domination. Another misunderstanding comes from comparing XRP with assets that have completely different issuance models. People often use Bitcoin style thinking where mining gradually distributes supply, but XRP was created with a fixed supply from the start, which means early distribution naturally appears more concentrated. That structure is not a flaw or manipulation, it is a design difference. However, most retail investors ignore this and judge XRP using frameworks that do not apply. Now, let's talk about what concentration actually does affect. It mainly impacts liquidity perception. When a large percentage of supply is believed to be held by fewer entities, traders assume there is hidden pressure waiting to enter the market. This creates fear during uncertainty and excitement during bullish phases. But again, perception does not equal reality. Unless those holdings are actively moving into circulation, they are not influencing price directly. There is also a second effect: volatility sensitivity. In markets where supply is perceived as concentrated, even small movements from large wallets can trigger exaggerated reactions. This is not because the market is truly unstable, but because participants overreact to visible blockchain activity without context. A single transfer becomes a headline in the minds of traders, even if it is just routine wallet management. Another overlooked point is time distribution. Even if large holders exist, the way they release or move assets over time matters far more than how much they hold. A wallet that holds billions but moves nothing for years has very different market impact compared to a wallet that actively distributes daily. So, concentration alone is incomplete information without movement timelines. Now, here is the uncomfortable truth most people avoid. Retail investors often misinterpret concentration because it gives them a psychological excuse. If prices are not moving as expected, it is easier to blame whales or centralization than to accept that market cycles are driven by liquidity, demand, and macro conditions. This mindset leads to emotional trading instead of strategic thinking. So, the real takeaway here is this: supply concentration in XRP is not a hidden signal of manipulation or guaranteed growth. It is a structural outcome of how the asset was created and how custody systems operate today. What matters more is whether that supply is active, idle, or gradually distributed into circulation. In the final part, we will connect all these pieces together and break down what the XRP rich list actually means for long term holders, and where most investors misread the biggest opportunity signals without realizing it. Now everything comes together, and this is where most people either get clarity or completely misunderstand the situation, depending on how honestly they are willing to think. The XRP rich list is not a prediction tool, not a hidden signal, and not a roadmap of where price is going next. It is simply a distribution map of supply at a given moment, shaped by history, custody systems, exchanges, and long term holders who behave very differently from retail traders. The biggest mistake investors make is treating rich lists like a scoreboard. They look at top wallets and assume those holders are winning or controlling the game. But ownership of supply does not equal control over market direction. Markets do not move because someone holds a large amount of an asset. Markets move because liquidity enters or exits, because demand changes, and because macro conditions shift. Wallet size alone does not create price movement. Now, let's be direct about something most people avoid. Even if XRP has large holders, that does not automatically mean anything bullish or bearish. It is neutral data. The meaning only comes from behavior over time. If large holders are inactive, the supply is effectively locked. If they gradually distribute, it adds liquidity. If exchanges adjust holdings internally, it creates noise that looks like activity but is not real market pressure. Without behavior analysis, the rich list is just numbers. Another important reality is that retail investors often overestimate the importance of whales. They believe large wallets plan market direction or coordinate outcomes. In most cases, that is not how it works. Large holders are usually focused on execution, efficiency, custody security, liquidity management, or long term positioning. They are not reacting to the same emotional triggers as short term traders. So, trying to mirror or fear their movements usually leads to incorrect conclusions. What actually matters for XRP going forward is how supply interacts with demand at scale. If more liquidity flows into active trading markets while a large portion of supply remains dormant, price can react strongly even with relatively small changes in demand. On the other hand, if dormant supply begins moving into circulation during weak demand periods, it can create downward pressure. This is basic market structure, not mystery behavior. There is also a psychological layer that cannot be ignored. The rich list creates narrative bias. When people see concentration, they tend to build stories around it, either extremely bullish or extremely negative. But narratives are not data, they are interpretations. And in crypto, interpretations often move faster than facts, which leads to emotional cycles of hype and fear that disconnect from actual on chain reality. So here is the clean conclusion: the XRP rich list is not something you use to predict price. It is something you use to understand structure. It tells you how supply is distributed, where liquidity is stored, and how custody systems are organized. But it does not tell you when price will move, how high it will go, or what direction it will take in the short term. If you want to use this information correctly, you need to stop treating wallets as players and start treating them as containers. Containers can hold value, but they do not decide market outcomes by themselves. The market decides outcomes based on interaction between supply, demand, and timing. Financial disclaimer: this content is for educational and informational purposes only and should not be considered financial or investment advice. Cryptocurrency markets are highly volatile and risky. Always do your own research, DVR, before making any investment decisions. Never invest money you cannot afford to lose. If you found this analysis helpful, consider subscribing and staying updated for more deep market breakdowns.